I still can't explain how the substitute teacher had photos of our houses on her desk, or why she kept staring at the empty chair in the back row where Sarah used to sit before she disappeared. I was 17 years old, a junior at Millbrook High School in Ohio, when the most terrifying day of my academic life unfolded. It was a dreary Monday morning in late October, the kind where the autumn mist clung to the school windows like ghostly fingers. Our regular English teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had been out sick for 3 days with what the administration called a family emergency. We'd had different substitutes each day, and honestly, most of us were hoping for another easy period where we could just watch a movie or work on homework from other classes. But when I walked into third period English that Monday, something felt immediately wrong. The woman standing behind Mrs. Henderson's desk was tall and unnaturally thin, with pale skin that seemed to have never seen sunlight. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful, and her black dress appeared to be from a different era entirely. But what struck me most were her eyes. They were an odd shade of gray, almost silver, and they seemed to follow each student as we filed into the classroom. "Good morning, class," she said, in a voice that was melodious, yet somehow unsettling. "My name is Ms. Blackwood, and I'll be your substitute teacher today." As I made my way to my usual seat in the third row, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There, scattered across Mrs. Henderson's desk, were what appeared to be photographs. But these weren't the typical family photos or classroom decorations we were used to seeing. Even from my seat, I could tell they were pictures of houses, and not just any houses. I recognized my own 2-story colonial with the distinctive blue shutters that my mom had insisted on painting last summer. "Today we're going to discuss Edgar Allan Poe," Ms. Blackwood continued, her silver eyes scanning the room. "But first, let me take attendance." She picked up what should have been Mrs. Henderson's grade book, but I could see it wasn't our regular attendance sheet. It looked more like a leather-bound journal with yellowed pages. "Michael Torres," she called out, looking directly at my friend Mike in the front row. "Here," Mike replied, but his voice sounded uncertain. Mrs. Henderson had never called him by his full name. She always used nicknames with students she liked, and Mike was always just Mike to her. "Jennifer Walsh," Ms. Blackwood continued, and Jenny raised her hand from across the room. "David Chen, that was me. But here's the thing, Chen isn't my last name, it's my middle name. My last name is Rodriguez. David Chen Rodriguez is my full name, but no teacher had ever called me David Chen, ever. Not even on the first day of school when they read from official rosters. The only person who knew that Chen was part of my name was my grandmother, who had insisted on the middle name to honor my grandfather. "Here," I managed to croak out, my mouth suddenly dry. Ms. Blackwood's silver eyes met mine, and she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that made you feel like prey being studied by a predator. She continued down her list, calling out names with an accuracy that was becoming increasingly disturbing. She knew that Ashley's last name was hyphenated, even though she dropped the second part since middle school. She knew that Robert went by Bobby except with his grandmother, who still called him Roberto. She knew details that shouldn't have been in any school record, but then she called a name that made the entire classroom fall silent. Sarah Mitchell. The empty desk in the back corner seemed to echo with the silence that followed. Sarah Mitchell had been in our class at the beginning of the school year. She'd been quiet, kept to herself mostly, but she was nice enough. Then, 3 months ago, she just disappeared. Her parents had filed a missing person report. The police had questioned students and teachers. There had been search parties and Amber Alerts, but Sarah Mitchell had vanished without a trace, as if she'd never existed at all. "Sarah Mitchell," Ms. Blackwood repeated, her eyes fixed on the empty chair where Sarah used to sit. She's not here," stammered Jessica, who had been Sarah's lab partner in chemistry. "She's been missing since—" "I know exactly where she is," Ms. Blackwood interrupted, her voice cutting through the classroom like ice. "She's closer than you think." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could see my breath forming small puffs of condensation, and several students began rubbing their arms for warmth. Ms. Blackwood walked over to the windows and drew the blinds, plunging the classroom into an unnatural twilight despite it being mid-morning. The fluorescent lights flickered but didn't provide their usual harsh brightness. Instead, everything seemed muted, as if we were underwater. "Now then," she said, returning to the front of the class, "let's talk about the telltale heart. Can anyone tell me what drives the narrator to madness?" Marcus, who always tried to impress teachers, raised his hand eagerly. The guilt from killing the old man? Close, Ms. Blackwood replied, but not quite accurate. It wasn't guilt that drove him mad. It was the knowledge that he could never truly hide what he had done. The heart continued to beat beneath the floorboards because some secrets refused to stay buried. As she spoke, she began walking between the rows of desks, her footsteps making no sound on the linoleum floor. When she passed my desk, I caught a whiff of something that made my stomach turn. It smelled like earth and decay, like something that had been underground for too long. You see, class, the most terrifying thing about Poe's stories isn't the supernatural elements, she continued, pausing next to Sarah's empty desk. It's the very human capacity for evil, the ability to hurt someone and then go on with your daily life as if nothing happened. She placed her pale hand on Sarah's empty chair, and I swear I could hear a faint creaking sound, as if someone invisible was sitting in it. Can anyone tell me what happened to the narrator after he confessed? She asked. Jenny raised her hand tentatively. He was arrested? Perhaps. But what if I told you that sometimes the dead don't stay dead? What if some victims refuse to rest until justice is served? The classroom was completely silent now. Even the usual sounds from the hallway seemed muted and distant. Ms. Blackwood returned to her desk and picked up one of the photographs I'd noticed earlier. She held it up, and my blood turned to ice. It was a perfect shot of my house, but not taken from the street. This was taken from inside my bedroom window, looking out at the house across the street. David, she said, looking directly at me, would you like to tell the class about what you did on the night of July 23rd? July 23rd. I knew that date. That was the night of Marcus's birthday party. The night Sarah had walked home alone because her ride had fallen through. The night she'd disappeared. I don't know what you're talking about, I managed to say, but my voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to myself. Really? Ms. Blackwood tilted her head, like a bird studying an insect, because I have some very interesting photographs here. Would you like to see them? She began laying out more photos on her desk. I couldn't see them clearly from my seat, but Marcus, who was in the front row, suddenly went pale and began to shake. Marcus, Ms. Blackwood said sweetly, you look unwell. Perhaps you'd like to share what's troubling you. I can't. Marcus was breathing heavily now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Can't what, Marcus? Can't tell them about the party? About what really happened when Sarah tried to walk home? The photos on Ms. Blackwood's desk seemed to multiply. More and more images appeared, as if materializing from thin air. I caught glimpses of what looked like surveillance photos, pictures of students from our class in various locations around town, all seemingly taken without their knowledge. You see, class, Ms. Moles, Blackwood continued, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality, Sarah never made it home that night. But she didn't just vanish into thin air, did she, boys? She was looking at Marcus and me now, and I felt a cold dread settling in my stomach. She asked for help, Ms. Blackwood said, pulling out a photo that made Marcus audibly gasp. She was walking alone, in the dark, and she was scared. When she saw familiar faces, she must have felt relieved. She trusted you. I remembered that night. Marcus and I had been leaving his party late, and we'd seen Sarah walking alone on Maple Street. She'd looked scared and asked if we could give her a ride home, but we'd been drinking and Marcus's car only seated two comfortably. We'd told her to call an Uber and driven off, leaving her there in the dark. It had seemed like no big deal at the time. Sarah was always weird anyway, and it wasn't our responsibility to play taxi service. But when she'd gone missing the next day, that moment had haunted both of us. We told her to call for a ride, I said defensively. It's not our fault she disappeared, Ms. Blackwood finished. Ooh, but it is your fault, David. You and Marcus. You left a frightened girl alone in the dark, on a street where someone had been prowling for weeks, looking for exactly that opportunity. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing Sarah at what appeared to be the moment we'd driven away. In the background of the image, barely visible in the shadows, was the silhouette of another figure. Someone was watching, Ms. Blackwood whispered. Someone who had been waiting for the perfect victim. Someone who saw two boys abandon their classmate and knew they'd found their chance. The classroom was dead silent except for Marcus's heavy breathing and the faint sound of someone crying. I think it was Jenny. Where is Sarah now? Asked Ashley, her voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Blackwood smiled that predatory smile again. She's been trying to tell you for months. Haven't you been listening? Suddenly, the empty chair in the back corner began to creak. Not just a settling sound, a rhythmic creaking, as if someone was rocking back and forth in it. Sarah has been attending every class, Ms. Blackwood continued. She's been sitting in her usual seat, trying to get your attention, trying to tell you what happened to her. But you've all been so busy with your own lives, haven't you? The creaking grew louder, and now I could swear I saw a faint outline in the chair, the suggestion of a figure, translucent and flickering like a bad television signal. She wants you to know about the man who followed her after you left, Ms. Blackwood said, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. She wants you to know about the abandoned house on Elm Street, where he took her. She wants you to know that she's still there, waiting. Marcus suddenly stood up, his chair falling backward with a crash. This is insane. You're just trying to scare us. Sarah probably ran away or something. Sit down, Marcus, Ms. Blackwood said calmly, and somehow Marcus's legs gave out, sending him crashing back into his seat. Sarah didn't run away. She continued. Sarah is dead. She has been for 3 months, and her spirit has been trying to communicate with everyone who failed her that night. More photos appeared on the desk, and this time I could see them clearly. They were security camera stills showing Sarah's final moments, walking alone down Maple Street, looking over her shoulder nervously, and then, nothing. The next photo in the sequence showed the empty street. The police found her body last week, Ms. Blackwood announced casually, as if commenting on the weather. She was in the basement of 2047 Elm Street, but they haven't identified her yet. Dental records take time, you know. My hands were shaking now. 2047 Elm Street was 3 blocks from where we'd left Sarah that night. I'd driven past it dozens of times since then, never knowing. Of course, finding her body was just the beginning. Ms. Blackwood continued. The real question is, what happens to the people who could have saved her but chose not to? The fluorescent lights flickered more dramatically now, and in the strobing light, I could clearly see Sarah sitting in her chair. She looked exactly as she had in life, except for her eyes. They were the same silver gray as Ms. Blackwood's. You could have saved me, Sarah's voice echoed through the classroom, though her mouth didn't move. You could have saved me, but you didn't want to be bothered. Other students were starting to panic now. Jenny was openly crying, Ashley was hyperventilating, and several kids were trying to get to the door, but it wouldn't budge as if it were sealed shut. Let us out, screamed Robert, pounding on the door. Let us out of here. Class isn't over, Ms. Blackwood said pleasantly. We still have so much to discuss. For instance, David, would you like to tell everyone about the phone call you received last Tuesday night? My blood went cold. Last Tuesday around midnight, my phone had rung. When I'd answered, there had been nothing but static and what sounded like someone crying in the distance. I'd hung up quickly and tried to forget about it, but it had kept me awake for hours. Or Marcus, she continued. Would you like to share what you've been seeing in your mirrors lately? Marcus looked like he was about to vomit. I knew exactly what she was talking about. He'd mentioned to me that he'd been seeing a girl's reflection behind him in mirrors, but when he'd turn around, nothing was there. Sarah has been trying so hard to get your attention, Ms. Blackwood explained. Phone calls, appearances in mirrors, moving objects in your rooms. She even tried visiting your dreams, but you've been ignoring all the signs. The temperature continued to drop, and now our breath was clearly visible. Ice began forming on the windows, creating intricate patterns that looked almost like skeletal hands reaching across the glass. What do you want from us? I finally managed to ask. Ms. Blackwood's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp and too white. Sarah wants justice, of course. She wants the person who killed her to be caught, and she wants the people who abandoned her to understand the consequences of their choices. Desperate. We didn't know, Marcus said desperately. We couldn't have known someone was going to hurt her. Couldn't you? Ms. Blackwood asked. There had been reports of a prowler in the neighborhood for weeks. Young women were being warned not to walk alone at night, but you were too drunk and too selfish to care about anyone but yourselves. More photos appeared on the desk, newspaper clippings about the prowler, police reports, warnings that had been posted around the neighborhood, evidence that we should have known it wasn't safe for Sarah to walk alone. The guilt has been eating at you both, Ms. Blackwood observed. Marcus has lost 15 pounds and stopped sleeping through the night. David has started avoiding Maple Street entirely and jumps at every unexpected sound. You both know, deep down, that you could have prevented her death. Sarah's ghostly figure was becoming more solid now, and I could see the pain and fear in her silver eyes. She looked exactly as she had the night we'd left her, scared, vulnerable, and desperately needing help that never came. I trusted you, Sarah's voice whispered directly into my mind. I thought you were my friends. I thought you would help me. Tears were streaming down my face now. The guilt I'd been trying to suppress for months was overwhelming me completely. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry, Sarah." Sobs. "Sorry isn't enough," Ms. Blackwood said coldly. "Sarah's killer is still free. The police don't have enough evidence to charge him, but you can help change that." She pulled out one final photograph, a clear shot of a man's face, someone I recognized from around town. He was in his 40s, lived alone, and worked the night shift at a local factory. I'd seen him at the gas station and the grocery store, but I'd never paid much attention to him. "This is Thomas Crane," Ms. Blackwood announced. "He's been watching young women in this town for years, waiting for the right opportunity. The night you abandoned Sarah, he finally got his chance." The photo showed Thomas Crane standing in the shadows near where we'd left Sarah, clearly stalking her. "The police need witnesses," Ms. Blackwood continued. "They need people to come forward with information about where Thomas Crane was that night, what he was doing, who might have seen him. Sarah's body can tell them how she died, but they need more evidence to prove it was him." "How do we know you're telling the truth?" asked Jenny through her tears. Ms. Blackwood pausumalsied Flenbers. Blackwood gestured to the photographs covering her desk. "Because Sarah has been watching, even after death. She's been gathering evidence, following her killer, documenting his movements. These photos aren't just memories, they're proof." The ghostly figure of Sarah stood up from her chair and walked to the front of the classroom. As she moved, I could see other translucent figures following her, other young women, all looking frightened and sad. "I wasn't his first victim," Sarah's voice echoed, "and I won't be his last unless someone stops him." Ms. Blackwood nodded gravely. "Thomas Crane has killed 4 girls over the past 2 years. Sarah was just the most recent, but she's the one who refused to rest until justice was served." The classroom door suddenly swung open, and warm air rushed in, dispelling some of the supernatural cold that had been building. But instead of feeling relieved, I felt a deep sense of responsibility settling on my shoulders. "The choice is yours," Ms. Blackwood said, her voice becoming more human and less otherworldly. "You can continue living with the guilt, knowing that you could have saved Sarah but chose not to. Or you can honor her memory by helping to catch her killer and prevent more deaths." Marcus was the first to speak. What do we need to do?" "Tell the police everything you remember about that night," Ms. Blackwood replied. "Tell them about seeing Thomas Crane in the neighborhood. Tell them about leaving Sarah alone. Give them the timeline they need to place him at the scene." Sarah's ghostly figure approached my desk, and I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. Not frightening, but sad and desperate. "Please," her voice whispered in my ear, "don't let him hurt anyone else." I looked around the classroom. My fellow students were all staring at me, waiting for my decision. Some looked terrified, others looked guilty, but all of them looked like they understood the weight of the choice we were facing. "Okay," I said finally. "We'll go to the police. We'll tell them everything." As soon as I spoke those words, the photographs on Ms. Blackwood's desk began to fade, and the temperature in the room started to return to normal. Sarah's ghostly figure smiled for the first time since she'd appeared, and the other spirits behind her seemed to relax. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, and then she was gone. Ms. Blackwood gathered the remaining photographs and placed them in a manila envelope. "The police station is 4 blocks from here. Detective Morrison is expecting you during lunch period." "How do you know Detective Morrison is expecting us?" I asked, but as I looked up, Ms. Blackwood was gone too. The desk was empty except for Mrs. Henderson's usual belongings, and the classroom looked completely normal. The bell rang, signaling the end of 3rd period, and students began filing out in stunned silence. But Marcus and I remained seated, staring at each other in shock. "Did that really just happen?" Marcus asked. I looked at the manila envelope that had been left on my desk. Inside were the photographs Ms. Blackwood had shown us, along with a note written in handwriting I didn't recognize. 24/7 Elm Street. Basement. Look for the blue bracelet Sarah was wearing the night she disappeared. Marcus and I did go to the police that day during lunch. We told Detective Morrison everything we remembered about the night Sarah disappeared, including our shameful decision to leave her alone. We gave him the photographs and told him about Thomas Crane. 3 days later, the police arrested Thomas Crane at his home on Oak Street. In his basement, they found evidence linking him to not just Sarah's murder, but 3 other unsolved cases from the past 2 years. Sarah's body was officially identified, and her family was finally able to hold a funeral and find some closure. Mrs. Henderson returned to school the following week, claiming she'd been dealing with a family emergency out of state. When we asked about the substitute teacher, she looked confused. "What substitute?" she asked. I left detailed lesson plans with the office. You were supposed to have study hall for 3 days. But according to the office, no substitute had been assigned to our class that Monday. In fact, there was no record of anyone named Ms. Blackwood ever working for the school district. Thomas Crane was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. During his trial, it came out that he'd been stalking young women in our town for over 3 years, looking for opportunities to strike when they were alone and vulnerable. The prosecutor mentioned in his closing statement that Sarah Mitchell's case might never have been solved if not for the testimony of 2 students who came forward with crucial information about the timeline of her disappearance. I graduated from Millbrook High 6 months later, but I never forgot about that day in Ms. Blackwood's classroom. I kept the manila envelope and the photographs as a reminder of what can happen when we choose not to help someone in need. About a year after graduation, I was cleaning out my room at home when I found something that made my blood run cold. It was my old yearbook from freshman year, and I was flipping through it when I came across the faculty section. There, in the row of substitute teachers, was a photograph of Ms. Blackwood. According to the yearbook, her name was Margaret Blackwood, and she had worked as a substitute teacher for the district from 1987 to 1991. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake some nights. According to the school's records, Margaret Blackwood had died in a car accident in December of 1991. She'd been killed by a drunk driver while walking home from school one evening, abandoned by students who could have given her a ride but chose not to, just like we had done to Sarah. I never told Marcus about finding that photograph. Some secrets are too heavy to share. But I did start volunteering for a local organization that provides safe rides home for young women, and I've never again walked away from someone who needed help, because now I know that some debts follow you beyond the grave, and some teachers never stop trying to educate us, even after death. The last time I drove past 2047 Elm Street, the abandoned house had been torn down and replaced with a small memorial garden. There's a bench there now with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Sarah Mitchell and all victims of violence, may they rest in peace knowing justice was served." Below that, in smaller letters, dedicated also to the memory of Margaret Blackwood, substitute teacher, 1957-1991. I stop there sometimes, just to sit for a while and remember. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light is just right, I swear I can see Sarah sitting on the bench beside me, finally at peace. But I never see Ms. Blackwood anymore. I think her work was done.